Day 982 of the Ukrainian War Map, also known as the Russo-Ukrainian War. Juzzie here, and today is another update as I take a simplified and down-to-earth approach to some of the most important happenings on the ground in Ukraine. So starting off, we'll take a look at those Russian losses, as currently Russia sits on more than 696,000 military personnel losses, representing an additional 1,460 in the past day. Then as for hardware losses, 6 tanks, 20 APVs, and 26 artillery. And of course, it was just yesterday that the 20,000 milestone was achieved for destroyed Russian artillery pieces. Which is actually not a lot when you think about it, because 20,000 destroyed artillery pieces over a 982-day period, when factoring in a 1,000-kilometer front line, means that only 2% of a Russian howitzer is destroyed every 1 kilometer. Or, put in a more human context, only one Russian howitzer is destroyed roughly every 50 kilometers of front lines. So the demilitarization of the largest Soviet stockpile in the world of howitzers of all shapes and sizes continues, and of all levels of monstrosity, desperation as well, with the repurposed BMP-1 Grom cannon, as an example, almost completely useless. Or my most recent favourite, the multiple launch rocket launcher single launcher downgrade, possibly even more useless. Then headed across to the map's territory of control percentages for a brief moment. As we can see, in a nutshell, Russia occupies 18.34% of Ukrainian land, Ukraine has liberated about 7%, Russia occupied 7% of Ukraine territory just prior to the Feb 24 full-scale invasion. That's Crimea and the Donbass. Then after that, the Russian military has captured and occupied 11%. All of which means that Russia's 3-day SMO, which they could reframe as a 3 or 4 Venus Day SMO now, has gained them just the 11% of Ukrainian territory since the full-scale invasion. But all done so in a way that's destroying their military on multiple metrics, and perhaps even more importantly, in the process destroying their economy progressively and disastrously. All for this additional 11% or so of land gained that they'll just end up having to concede in the long run anyway, not to mention the decades of war reparations to pay back. Then to the map, and being a Friday, it seems most people might prefer me belting out a few quick updates instead. So starting off in Kharkiv, with reports this morning that the AFU entered into Buravatka, just west of Vovchansk, then very close by, but within Russia, as the positional skirmishes continue between Russian and Ukrainian forces at Zuralevka. Now, putting it into dark mode will explain some of the context of this location better, as the main supply line by road for the Lipsy sector, right flank of the Russian forces in this area, becomes inherently threatened. As a result, this risks much of the 6 months of Russian work performed here to obtain this 90 square kilometer piece of land. And yet, Russia would seek to retain this captured land as much as they can, even if it's only to avoid an even more embarrassing political loss. Oh, then, since we're at Belgorod, a recent update has shown that last night, Russians complained that Ukraine shot down an air target over this Russian oblast with a Patriot system. Russian military blogger Fighter Bomber says they lost an Su-34. This is the Sukhoi jet that's used for a lot of air support around the front lines. So that very recent news is a pretty big deal, as noted by the Russian aviation adjacent military blogger. Then further into the Ukrainian map, as Ukrainian forces have reportedly advanced further and improved their position in Toretsk of the Donbass region. So this location clearly didn't go to plan, at least as the Russian forces may have expected. Coming up against Ukrainian defences in this region has turned out to be something of a shock for the Russian side. And as it turns out, for the Ukrainian side, their units have been well equipped with drones, protective gear, the small arms fire, and small and even tiny nano-sized drones. But above all, it's the stark difference we've seen in the training quality of Russian soldiers versus Ukrainian soldiers. The Russian approach is a manpower quantity over quality approach, but what happens if they were to run out of quantity? Then they'd be an army with no quantity or quality, which is not a very useful place to be in. Then headed down on the map, and speaking a bit more generally on the topic of the Vuhledar axis, where, long story short, it's the AFU's job to keep the Russian advances at bay from the south. So Russia is testing various Ukrainian defenses here, with the Russian army ideally looking for themselves to come up through Shakhtarsk and churn through their manpower all the way up to the main highway up to Constantinople, as a means to force Ukrainian withdrawals. So this is where sufficient artillery reserves would come in very handy here, for which to support AFU defenses with. Then headed all the way up on the map to Kursk. Some crazy things happening here. But starting off with some brief activity updates, as we're seeing the continued expansion of the graveyard as far as Russian armor is concerned, with old Russian BMP-1 and 2 infantry fighting vehicles getting destroyed left, right and center on this Korenovo axis of attack. Some close to the front lines and others not so close. And speaking of not so close, because some 25 kilometers or 15 miles north of the front lines at the Rilsk-Kursk highway, there was also the spotted incident of the destruction of a Russian military truck, targeted by unconfirmed means, but at this distance no doubt caused by something with a reasonable level of precision. Then to a Koreans in Kursk segment, as the following footage is reportedly a North Korean soldier healing from battlefield engagements, where he managed to evacuate himself through a chance survival. Now I can't fully verify the footage, with being at least mildly skeptical, due to the really high specificity in the level of translation here. But we'll take a look at it anyway. So long story short, this wounded North Korean soldier is reported to have said the following, that he was a unit of about 40 North Korean soldiers. They were rushed to perform Kursk infantry attacks against artillery and drones of the AFU. The Russians promised them that they would build fortifications and they would be able to guard those objects, but nope. They got sent on an assault in Kursk without being provided anything, without prior intelligence, without ammunition, without normal weapons. He said they were used as bait and that Ukrainian weapons are superior to Russian ones, and that Putin has deceived both them and Kim Jong-un. He also called it a meat grinder, and that the Russian commander told him that he betrayed his country because he did not die in battle. He also paints a very grim picture of the Russian side of the battlefield, the conditions they face. So this man, reportedly, tells quite the story, both astonishing and, you know what, expected. So potentially the first of many flat-out crazy stories we hear on this front, on this literal front. Then as it relates to North Korea and Kursk, because in an interview with South Korean television, Ukrainian President Zelensky explains that Russia would only escalate from a lack of Western response, with saying that if Ukraine's allies don't respond to Russia sending 10,000 North Koreans, then they will send 100,000, as has always been the case with everything Russia does. Then to take a look more on the theme of Korean troop integration into the Russian military, because for something of a lighter segment to report on, or possibly very dark to report on, we've come across a Korean-Russian battlefield phrasebook, including the sentence, "Why did you eat the dog, patron?" So little do any of them know that they could be on the other end of the food chain when making their way into Ukraine. If you know what I mean. I think this dog does. Then headed to the south of the map and getting out of dark mode, which some of you guys don't seem to like, but every now and then it can serve its purpose. And taking a brief look at Crimea, so in follow-up to some previous events, as it's since been confirmed that Ukrainian forces successfully struck the K1 Podlet radar near Cape Tarkankut in Crimea on October 23 using a kamikaze drone. Despite the hit, the radar station remains physically in place, awaiting evacuation now a week later, underscoring the vulnerability of Russian defenses in the area. The Podlet K1, which is considered state-of-the-art for Russia, is specifically used to detect small UAVs and is estimated to cost approximately $6 million US. Then taking a brief look around somewhere in the east as 2 Russian infantry fighting vehicles participated in a flying turret challenge right next to each other and merely seconds apart, courtesy of the 46th Airmobile Brigade. Then we saw the destruction of a Russian Buk air defense system, nestled in by a lake in a tree line for some hope of protection. Then headed across to some news for today, and we'll start out with some not exactly Russian hardware news, but it is one of my favorite segments, so here we have it. Well, first we had the Cope Cage, then we had the turtle shells, but given their lack of effectiveness in repelling anything from a drone to a double-charged Javelin ATGM, now we see Russia's latest in-field innovation, a Cope Cage on top of a turtle shell. Now, as per these proud Russian infield engineers, they said that the T-72 tank chassis had the turret removed as they were unable to replace the guns damaged or worn out in battle, so they're recycling the hull and turning these things into ultra-low visibility, mine-clearing pressure cookers. Now, here's the thing. If the first drone with an RGP warhead strapped to its belly doesn't work, then the second one is just much more likely to. In other words, this version 2 is likely to only have a success rate equal to that of version 1. Then headed across to some economy news. So Russian economy news, as Russia is still attempting to curb inflation even after a rate hike to a historic high of 21% just this time last week, where the Deputy Prime Minister of Russia is now ordering immediate measures to be taken to attempt to manage food prices in particular. Now, as an example, the cost of potatoes in Russia has increased by 54.7% since that's just the beginning of this year, which is impressively close to what I believe to be an overall 60% rate of inflation per annum in Russia, where third-party analyst bodies outside of the country put the inflation rate at. And this is where it also gets interesting, because about 6 months ago, a Russian government department threatened a private Russian agency about publishing information about rising food prices, because in Russia, if you don't like bad news and you're the government, you bury it. And out of all of this, I'm somehow reminded of this time last year, in fact, when the Russian government was in complete denial over inflation of any kind, where they explained the skyrocketing egg prices were just because Russians began to eat a lot of them. As they say, all due to the increased growing welfare of Russians. Couldn't be further from the truth. And even still, it was the exact excuse provided by none other than Putin himself on national TV. Eggs were sold in units of 1 at the time, not a dozen, with mass scarcity. The great Russian egg shortage of last winter, all because Russians are too wealthy. Then headed across to a quick funny to round it all off for today, guys. So the head of the Russian Orthodox Church proposed to limit Russians' entertainment through the TV box. Heaven forbid they watch something other than Solivov. It's propaganda or nothing. But the following news couldn't be better timed, because right at the same time, Russian top propagandist Solivov and his show has dropped out of the top 50 rated Russian TV programs for the first time. And really, I don't blame the viewers for the lack of viewership, due to the amount of absurdity on that show, which has increased tenfold ever since the 3-day SMO went into its 4th day. So that's it for today, guys. Thanks again for watching. Please continue to like, comment, subscribe, all of those wonderful things, and I do hope to see all of you guys, each and every one of you, there in the next one. Cheers!